Welcome to Black History That Everyone Should Know. I'm your host, J.Earl Twyman, and today's segment is on Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was an American educator, author, orator, and advisor to multiple presidents of the United States. Between 1890 and 1915, Washington was the dominant leader in the African American community and the contemporary black elite. Washington was from the last generation of black American leaders born into slavery and became the leading voice of the former slaves and their descendants. They were newly oppressed in the South by disenfranchisement and the Jim Crow discrimination laws that were enacted in the post-Reconstruction Southern states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Booker was born into slavery to Jane, an enslaved African American woman, on the plantation of James Burroughs in southwest Virginia near Hell's Fords in Franklin County. He never knew the day, month, and year of his birth, but the year on his headstone reads 1856. Nor did he ever know his father, said to be a white man who resided on a neighboring plantation. The man played no financial or emotional role in Washington's life. From his earliest years, Washington was known simply as Booker, with no middle or surname in the practice of the time. His mother, her relatives, and his siblings struggled with the demands of slavery. He later wrote, "I cannot recall a single instance during my childhood or early boyhood when our entire family sat down to the table together and God's blessings was asked and the family ate a meal in a civilized manner." On the plantation in Virginia and even later, meals were gotten to the children very much as dumb animals received theirs. It was a piece of bread here and a scrap of meat there. It was a cup of milk at one time and some potatoes at another. When he was 9, Booker and his family in Virginia gained freedom under the Emancipation Proclamation as U.S. troops occupied their region. Booker was thrilled by the formal day of their emancipation in early 1865. As the great day grew near, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring, and lasted later into the night. Most verses of the plantation songs had some reference to freedom. Some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. After the reading, we were told that we were all free and can go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children with tears of joy running down her face. She explained to us what it all meant, and that this was the day for which she had been so long praying for, but feared that she would never live to see. After the emancipation, Jane took her family to the free state of West Virginia to join her husband, Washington Ferguson, who had escaped from slavery during the war and settled there. The illiterate boy Booker began to painstakingly teach himself to read and attended school for the first time. At school, Booker was asked for a surname for registration. He took the family name of Washington after his stepfather. Still later he learned from his mother that she had originally given him the name Booker Taliaferro at the time of his birth, but his second name was not used by the slave master. Upon learning of his original name, Booker immediately readopted it as his own and became known as Booker Taliaferro Washington for the rest of his life. Washington worked in salt furnaces and coal mines in West Virginia for several years to earn money. He made his way east to Hampton Institute, a school established in Virginia to educate freedmen and their descendants, where he also worked to pay for his studies. He later attended Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. in 1878. In 1881, the Hampton Institute president, Samuel C. Armstrong, recommended Washington, then age 25, to become the first leader of Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, now known as Tuskegee University in Alabama. The new school opened on July 4, 1881, initially using a room donated by the Butler chapter of AME Zion Church. The next year, Washington purchased a former plantation to be developed as the permanent site of the campus. Under his direction, his students literally built their own school, making bricks, constructing classrooms, barns, and buildings, and growing their own crops and raising livestock, both for learning to provide for the most basic necessities. Both men and women had to learn trades as well as academics. The Tuskegee facility used all the activities to teach the student basic skills to take back to their mostly rural black communities throughout the South. The main goal was not to produce farmers and tradesmen, but teachers of farmers and trades who could teach in the new lower schools and colleges for blacks across the South. The school expanded over the decades, adding programs and departments to become the present-day Tuskegee University. A large, comfortable home called the Oaks was built on campus for Washington and his family. They moved into the house in 1900. Washington lived there until his death in 1915. His widow Margaret lived at the Oaks until her death in 1925. Washington led Tuskegee for more than 30 years after becoming its leader. As he developed it, adding to both the curriculum and the facilities on campus, he became a prominent national leader among African Americans, with considerable influence with wealthy white philanthropists and politicians. Washington expressed his vision for his race through the school. He believed that by providing needed skills to society, African Americans would play their part, leading to acceptance by white Americans. He believed that blacks would eventually gain full participation in society by acting as responsible, reliable American citizens. Shortly after the Spanish-American War, President William McKinley and most of his cabinet visited Booker, Washington. By his death in 1915, Tuskegee had grown to encompass more than 100 well-equipped buildings, roughly 1,500 students, 200 faculty members teaching 38 trades and professions, and an endowment of approximately $2 million. Washington helped develop other schools and colleges. In 1891, he lobbied the West Virginia State Legislature to locate the newly authorized West Virginia Colored Institute in the Kanawha Valley of West Virginia near Charleston. He visited the campus often and spoke at their first commencement exercise. It is now today West Virginia State University. Washington was a dominant figure of the African American community, then still overwhelmingly based in the South, from 1890 to his death in 1915. His Atlanta address of 1895 received national attention. He was considered as a popular spokesman for African American citizens. Representing the last generation of black leaders born into slavery, Washington was generally perceived as a supporter of education for freed men and their descendants in the post-Reconstruction Jim Crow era of the South. He stressed basic education and training in manual and domestic labor trades because he thought these represented the skills needed in what was still a rural economy. Throughout the final 20 years of his life, he maintained his standing throughout a nationwide network of supporters, including black educators, ministers, editors, and businessmen, especially those who supported his views on social and educational issues for blacks. He also gained access to top national white leaders in politics, philanthropy, and in education, raised large sums of money, was consulted on race issues, and was awarded honorary degrees from Harvard in 1896 and Dartmouth College in 1901. Later in his career, Washington was criticized by civil rights leader and NAACP founder W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and his supporters opposed the Atlanta Address as the Atlanta Compromise because it suggested that African Americans should work for and submit to white political rule. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights, due process of law, and increased political representation for African Americans, which he believed could only be achieved through activism and higher education for African Americans. He believed that the talented 10th would lead the race. Du Bois labeled Washington the Great Accommodator. Washington responded that confrontation could lead to disaster for the outnumbered blacks, and that cooperation with supportive whites was the only way to overcome racism in the long run. While promoting moderation, Washington contributed secretly and substantially to mounting legal challenges activist African Americans launched against segregation and disenfranchisement of blacks. In his public role, Washington believed he could achieve more by skillful accommodation to the social realities of the age of segregation. Washington's work on education helped him enlist both the moral and substantial financial support of many major white philanthropists. He became a friend of such self-made men as Standard Oil magnate Henry Huddleston Rogers, Sears Roebuck and Company president Julius Rosenwald, and George Eastman, inventor of the roll film, founder of Eastman Kodak, and developer of a major part of the photography industry. These individuals and many other wealthy men and women funded his causes, including Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes. He also gave lectures to raise money for the school. On January 23, 1906, he lectured at Carnegie Hall in New York City. It was to honor the silver anniversary of Tuskegee. He spoke along with great orators of the day, including Mark Twain, Joseph Hodges Coate, and Robert Curtis Ogden. It was the start of a campaign to raise $1,800,000 for the school. The schools which Washington supported were founded primarily to produce teachers, as education was critical for the black community following emancipation. Freedmen strongly supported literacy and education as the keys to their future. When graduates returned to their largely impoverished rural Southern communities, they found few schools and education resources, as the white-dominated state legislatures consistently underfunded black schools in their segregated system. To address those needs in the 20th century, Washington enlisted his philanthropic network to create matching funds programs to stimulate construction of numerous rural public schools for the black communities in the South. Working especially with Julius Rosenwald from Chicago, Washington had Tuskegee architects develop model school designs. The Rosenwald Fund helped support the construction and operation of more than 5,000 schools and related resources for the education of blacks throughout the South in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The local schools were a source of community pride. African American families gave labor, land, and money to the schools to give their children more chances in an environment of poverty and segregation. A major part of Washington's legacy, the model rule schools, continued to be constructed into the 1930s with matching funds for communities from the Rosenwald Fund. Washington also contributed to the Progressive Era by forming the National Negro Business League. It encouraged entrepreneurship among black businessmen, establishing a national network. As one of the founders of the National Negro Business League, his base was the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college that he founded in Tuskegee, Alabama. As lynchings in the South reached a peak, he continued to call for black progress through education and entrepreneurship, rather than trying to challenge directly the Jim Crow segregation and the disenfranchisement of black voters in the South. Washington mobilized a nationwide coalition of middle-class blacks, church leaders, and white philanthropists and politicians, with the long-term goal of building the community's economic strength and pride by focusing on self-help and schooling. With his own contributions to the black community, Washington was a supporter of racial uplift, but secretly he also supported court challenges to segregation and restrictions on voter registration. Black activists in the North, led by W.E.B. Du Bois, at first supported the Land Compromise, but later disagreed and opted to set up the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People to work for political change. They tried with limited success to challenge Washington's political machine for leadership in the black community, but built wider networks along the white allies in the North. Decades after Washington's death in 1915, the civil rights movement of the 1950s took a more active and progressive approach, which was also based on new grassroots organizations based in the South, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Washington mastered the nuances of the political arena in the late 19th century, which enabled him to manipulate the media, raise money, develop strategy, network, reward friends, and distribute funds while punishing those who opposed his plans for uplifting blacks. His long-term goal was to end the disenfranchisement of the vast majority of African Americans who still lived in the South. Washington's legacy has been very controversial to the civil rights community, of which he was an important leader before 1915. After his death, he came under heavy criticism for accommodationism to white supremacy. However, a more balanced view of his very wide range of activities has appeared since the late 20th century. As of 2010, the most recent studies defend and celebrate his accomplishments, legacy, and leadership. This has been J.Earl Twyman, and we hope that you've enjoyed Booker T. Washington on this segment of Black History That We Should All Know. If you enjoyed today's segment, please do not forget to select the like and subscribe buttons below to our channel so we can provide you with more interesting topics.